Hello, I'm Jay Tyler, and welcome to Radio Week, sponsored by Red Tech. Today, we've got an amazing group of panelists. We're going to discuss building modern broadcast facilities. And today, we're going to talk about infrastructure, planning, technology that you're going to be using in these facilities, along with good practices on how to build radio facilities and when is the appropriate time. With us today, we've got Kelly Parker from Wheatstone Corporation. He's our Director of Development. Kelly has got over 40 years of broadcast experience working from manufacturing and starting out as a radio engineer. We've got Brian King, who is from Melbourne, Australia. He is in charge of King Audio. He's one of our premier integrators. He's been building radio and TV studios around Australia for decades. Marcus Bekker, he brings 40 years of experience from manufacturing in the UK to retail sales to installation and consulting through New Zealand. And finally, Shaun Dolan. Shaun is a co-owner of Inrush Broadcast. Shaun's been, again, from all ends of the industry, started out in Champaign, Illinois as a broadcast engineer. He's worked for integrators, he's worked for manufacturers, and now he's one of the co-owners of Inrush, who's one of our premier integrators here in the United States. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you guys for attending Radio Week.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Marcus, I guess we're going to start with you this morning. When do you start a project? And I guess what people want to know, when is a good time to build a radio studio? We've got sales of radio stations, we've got new stations, we get people moving their leases and having to build new homes. When does that process start for you as an integrator or a consultant?
So if you mean when do we get involved as integrators and consultants? Yeah. Entirely on the client. I mean, you in an ideal world, it would be right at the very, very genesis of the project. Sadly, it's not always the case. But in the ideal world, as soon as the need arises for the customer, and that could be, as you've suggested, because of a building move, because of a lease coming up, numerous reasons, including just simply the fact that the equipment is old and done, ancient analog stuff. I mean, over here, we're not so much now because we've got most of it out, but there is still a bit kicking around. I mean, we've been doing, especially amongst the community radio sector, replacing equipment. When I was making some notes earlier, I was kind of looking back and going, man, some of the stuff is from the early 80s or even earlier in some of these radio stations. I'm not necessarily talking about consoles, but some of the equipment that we're having to actually replace is actually getting on very much in age. So we get involved early on in the project as we can. I guess is the answer. And really, as integrators and subcontractors, we really rely on the clients to reach out. In a lot of cases, we have those sometimes decades of relationship with the client.
Yeah. So when you're looking at when you're consulting with these clients, and I guess this is a question everybody can answer, is it a percentage? How much harder is it to do a build-in place from your infrastructure standpoint, core drilling, running cables, all of soundproofing, than moving into a new facility? Sometimes does it make sense for a customer to abandon the existing facility due to cost and infrastructure and move into a new facility?
Well, I mean, for me, we've had occasions where both apply. We've had occasions where the building has just been such an absolute dog that it really is time to get shot of it. And I would imagine that probably most of the time there are a lot of other factors outside of the engineering sphere that would influence that decision. Client, but also in a lot of cases, where you've got that infrastructure there, you've got the existing soundproofing, existing cable routes, existing, in some cases, equipment racks. It makes a lot of sense to overbuild it.
Okay. Kelly, what about you? You built hundreds of studios in the past.
I would say that in place is much harder than a new build, but again, it's not always cost effective to do that. So you've got to make that decision based on all the needs, where you are, where you want to go. So I would say that it's much harder to build around radio stations that need to stay on the air 24/7.
Okay, Shaun, you've got a lot of experience in the major markets here in the U.S., Chicago, New What is your theory? I mean, a lot of these facilities are actually getting smaller with smart scheduling, and in smart studios, we're able to probably do more with less. What's your thoughts on new house versus an existing house?
Sure. Agreed with Kelly that building in place is a lot more complex. Certainly doable. And as you said, we can kind of move studios around and swing people around such that it doesn't really cause too much disruption. But at the same time, you sort of sacrifice some of the sort of large scale end-to-end testing and training opportunities that you get when you can bring people over from, say, the old building to the new building and actually have them, do a practice air shift without having to worry about the actual, the automation system feeding air, or the studios feeding air, or the air chain at all feeding air. So that's a huge thing, is to be able to get everything right before the staff moves in. But as Kelly said, of course, the budgets don't always allow for that sort of thing. So we try and bring the best of that experience in when we need to do a build in place. But for those companies and groups that actually have the resources, and where quality and consistency and training for the staff is paramount, they typically won't do a build in place, whether it's moving from one floor to another or across town. Typically there'll be a brand new system stood up almost entirely separately from the old.
Okay, that makes sense. And Brian, I'm going to ask you lastly, because I've been to your facility that you've been migrating over the last few years. How about some of the challenges that you face while trying to keep, everybody on air, systems in place, but building new studios and scheduling? Do you have any stories or any insight you can give us about that?
Yes, it's called working overnight. Yeah, and working overnight and trying to work around people. When you've got an operational facility, and we're talking about a 5 studio cluster, and quite often there'll be at least 2 studios being used. It's not practical to try and do this sort of work during the day. So in our case, because we were doing, as you say, Jay, we were putting a complete audio over IP system in, backbone with a rewire, and it took a lot of work. And it was much, much easier to work through the night and get sort of all those major wiring components done, and then move on from there.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. I did want to welcome all of our listeners now. I believe we've got a good following for those that are listening and watching live. Also, anybody that's looking afterwards. If there's anybody in our listening audience that has questions, please feel free to ask them. As soon as we're done speaking on each topic, we'll take a few minutes and answer your questions. Okay, well, so the next topic we're going to talk about, and I'm going to direct this to Shaun. Obviously AOIP, because that's what we do. But besides buying AOIP for a studio in the console and routing stuff, what are some must-haves that you're seeing people put in every single studio, whether it's New York City or Champaign, Illinois? What are some things that people have to have now?
Sure. Well, in terms of buying the actual audio over IP system, I think it's important that folks think about how extensible it is and how you can interface to it. So, for example, with Wheatstone, there's the WheatNet ACI, the automation control interface. That's essentially a API that lets you connect other things. And that's really the whole name of the game for audio over IP. If you're not truly integrating all your other equipment and software into your AOIP system, you're really not getting your money's worth, especially in larger, more complex facilities, or in facilities with, say, a lot of studios or other infrastructure. So one example might be automated camera systems that use that ACI to get data on the configuration of the studio from scripting, that use data like the on-off status and the levels of the different microphones to do things like intelligent camera switching. So it can know who's speaking at any given moment and automatically switch the camera to them. It can have in separate software. It has different algorithms set up, different thresholds set up, so that it really feels like a live camera operator to a large extent. And there's a number of companies that do this, but we just installed a system recently where that was the case, and it was really quite impressive once we got it connected to the WheatNet system to see it switching cameras back and forth without having to have the producer, who's doing 10,000 other things anyways, sit there and try to do it themselves, or even have to edit it after the fact. So that's a great example. Another is virtual interfaces. We did a project recently where it wasn't practical for space reasons or really for timeline reasons to be able to get a whole bunch of physical surfaces into a couple dozen or so production rooms. And so we used Glass LXE, and that worked out really well because in that case you get all the functionality of an LXE, minus the tactile part, of course. But that's perfect for a production room where you're not doing a lot of quick actions. You're not doing anything really live. So that's another great example of how you can leverage your AOIP system to add other things aside from, in our case, blades and physical surfaces.
Awesome. Brian, what about you? So in all your studios, I see this big television and this large monitor where you're displaying meters, time of day, status. How essential do you think that is for all these new builds?
I think more and more these days, the more that the talent can see, the more indicators that are being displayed, they can see what's actually going on, not just within the studio, but outside the studio. At our complex, for example, because of audio over IP and logic control, we're doing things like intercoms, releasing magnetic latches on doors to allow people in. All these sort of things are being done off the console. But a visual indicator is something that people want these days. That's the bottom line. And you have a big screen with a visual indicator, and you've got a door light flashing, you've got a studio light flashing, or you've got somebody's trying to contact you. It's a big thing, and as I say, you can do it all these days, with logic control using audio over IP.
Yeah, touching on what Shaun says, we have an ACI, Wheatstone, and all the audio manufacturers do these days. They've got different protocols, but with a single cable, it allows you to peek into the AOIP world, grab statuses, grab cross points, timers, clocks, all of that stuff, and bring it out to the outside world. I've got a question for Kelly next, but Marcus, is there anything that you use as a staple in New Zealand, whether it's a world feed panel, it's a USB input, anything that you feel that's mission critical now to these studios for the users or the producers?
Oh, look, I think there's just a host of expectations these days. I mean, the new gear, as people are rolling it out, as users are using it, and people move around different companies and different facilities, those sort of things are taken as read. There'll be a USB input, there'll be auxiliary input, but I think the biggest change, I think Shaun spent some time talking about this, really is the fact that this medium has become a whole lot more multimedia, and it is just not simply audio anymore. There is an expectation pretty much at every facility you build that if they don't already have it, that there will be a video component in the future. And when you look at modern day studios, to whether it's low end community up to the big flashy high celebrity studios, there's always going to be extra screens. There's always going to be much more of that interactive environment, whether it be RGB LEDs all over the place, changing colors of studios, studio status, so on and so forth, to panels on the wall that can change. And I know I know the Inrush guys do this a lot over in the States there. These studios become completely different identities based on an event on the desk and what the automation system's saying, what show's coming out of that. And this is just the way to do it now.
At Town Square, they own about 380 stations here in America. Kelly was director of technology or director of engineering for those guys for the last 5 years. One of the big things that you'll see whenever you walked into a Town Square media facility is a big television, a 60 or 70-inch monitor. And on that was displayed each brand and a bunch of information. Kelly, tell us about what you did for each of your brands with your signal flows, also with your tie line codecs and what you're doing that, because I think the people out in the audience don't understand what you can do with this technology and how easy it makes things for the talent users and just a visual feedback in the hallway.
It falls right in line with what Brian said about notifying the operators that are in the building, because there's fewer and fewer of them these days, as you know. So the more information they can get in front of them, the better it is. So using things like Screen Builder and the meter app on large televisions in hallways where the jocks are and other people are passing through all the time, so they can see status of the radio stations. So displaying things like the complete air change. So if something fails in the stations off the air, you can look at the meter app and decide what part of the air chain failed from start to finish, from the automation straight out through to the transmitter site. And if you've got connectivity to your transmitter site, you can pull that information back. You can have blades out that feed you back logic control, visual controls, things like that. So I think it's really important. From a remote standpoint, we would bring tie line gateways, Merlins, Genies, all the contact closures in. Using the reported apps, the guys could go out in the field and do remotes with their iPhones with an iRig plugged into it and a microphone and dial in. We could have automatic routing into the studio, so there doesn't have to be an operator sitting at the console to put it on. In fact, most of the time, a studio was not even involved with the process. It was something that was happening in the rack room inside the blades with the utility mixers. So it's very easy with all the ACI and all the control that we give in the Wheatstone products to do that and display it.
Now, it's funny when you say the ACI. One of the things that I think that where integrators and where the King Audios and Inrush and Southern Broadcasts come in is we are doing a lot to interface with other people. And that's where an integrator comes in. And some of these things that you guys discussed might be outside the skill set of a local engineer. And I always want to tell people to embrace integrators. An integrator takes an automation system and an AOIP system and a telephone system, and they bring those together. And so as a station owner out there or an engineer, don't be afraid to consult somebody and bring them in. These guys are in the field working daily and with a wide variety of products that you've probably never seen or heard before in their traditional broadcast advertising environment. So I always want to recommend that. So to all you integrators, and I'm going to start with Shaun, one of the biggest pieces of technology that I think AOIP brings as far as integration goes is the AOIP driver. And the driver is basically, we used to call it our PC blade. But how important has been the driver for your company and the clients over the last 15 years since everybody's been rolling these out?
Sure. Absolutely critical, both to the infrastructure, technically, because sometimes you just don't really have the space or maybe the ability to get hardware sound cards. But also, if you just think about how much rack space it adds to not just have a potentially an outboard sound card or audio interface, but then to have to interface that to to blades or any other sort of I/O device. It's a little bit redundant, adds extra labor, extra points of failure. So the driver has been absolutely essential. In a lot of cases, we can use really small form factor PCs for certain tasks with drivers, and suddenly you have a couple of dozen workstations in a really small form factor, and that wouldn't be possible without the driver. It also makes remote provisioning of devices a lot simpler because you're not really adding any audio, and that speaks to perhaps the lack of local staff on site, as that sort of is unfortunately shrinking over time, and the folks that are still around locally are quite busy as their responsibilities get loaded up on them. So being able to essentially, ship a box somewhere, have the operations person plug it into power network into pre-labeled cables that are shipped with the device as we do from time to time. Put it in the rack where we have it specified in the rack elevation. It comes online, it shows up, we actually do our configuration, and there was no engineering required on site to deploy something like a codec or an additional automation workstation or even a streaming utility machine.
Marcus, what about you down there? You deal with the Zeta guys, with the Playout One. How essential has a driver been to your markets?
Well, listen, if just to add on to what Shaun said, I think that the biggest advantage of the driver, and where it is absolutely critical, is in virtualized situations. I remember when stations started putting a lot of their automation system, a lot of their AServe playout in the case of RCS into virtualized machines, and it would have been impossible to do without actually having a software driver. And I remember the joy that was everywhere when that software driver actually didn't need to use a dongle, because it became a whole lot easier, and you can put a software license in it. So absolutely essential when you're doing any form of virtualization.
Yeah, I'll speak to that too really quick. We had what we called our Town Square Log Assist for our remote voice trackers to dial into virtual machines, and it was a server farm that lived in Indiana that all of these guys logged into, and it was all virtual drivers on them with the licenses, no dongles, and there were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 of them.
Yeah, it's as Shaun said, it's a space savings and a cost savings. We have a facility in New York City that's running 120 virtual PC blades. I don't know how many channels it is, but it's hundreds and hundreds of channels. That alone would take several racks and thousands of dollars in sound cards and bound boxes. Yeah. Brian, what about you? Do you love the driver? I mean, you were doing this before there was drivers.
Yeah, look, the drivers are great. As the others have said, it minimises the amount of actual real estate you've got to use. It really tidies things up. Makes it much easier for everybody at the end of the day. I have no complaints.
This is a legitimate question. Do the end users care? Does the board operator, does the general manager, does anybody notice a difference between drivers and sound cards? I mean, is it more of an engineering luxury?
No.
Yep, they don't know.
No.
Yep. But as far as and then lastly, we do actually have a question. It ties into the driver. So one of the things that, we're talking about drivers for automation, playout, ad machines. We've got a question. Jose Lorero asked, can anyone share experiences on solutions for integrating reporters on videos and radio simultaneously? I guess I'll pose this to because he asked this. What about like during the pandemic when everybody was using Zoom and all these different types of video and audio applications for radio to do remotes? Can any of you guys touch on that? Have you any experience with that at all?
Yeah. Well, we do. We still do it. We'd have a dedicated Zoom computer, which is tied into the WheatNet system, and we have, because my main station's a big multicultural station, and they're forever wanting to do Zoom calls with people from overseas. So it still gets a fair bit of use.
Okay, Shaun, what about you?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, during the pandemic, that was huge. The ability to log into a machine and essentially, somebody comes to say we want to use Zoom, Teams, Google Meet, whatever, and be able to essentially dedicate an additional extra pair of sources and destinations on that machine to those apps, and to automatically use a bus minus from the console, it's a bit magical compared to the sort of old days of having to try and find another mix minus bus on the console and like wire it up.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect example of how audio over IP can be really smart from a budgetary perspective, and investing in that can save you tons of cost down the road, because changes are not only faster, but they're cheaper when somebody can log in for half an hour and configure something remotely, as opposed to drive, fly, whatever, to the station, spend some time on site, wire things up, and spend, I think it's fair to say, depending on the complexity of the studio, one could spend potentially almost a full day end to end configuring and then wiring something like that, in the dark ages as opposed to now.
Okay. Jose, another question. He asked about Zoom and others getting audio quality than a clean feed or a Lucy type solution. Jose, Shaun just brought that up. Giving somebody a discrete mix minus out of a console will give you good quality, opposed to just having a general Zoom meeting in a room. But there are ways to increase that quality by giving people dedicated mix minuses and not letting the software do that, and do that discreetly through the console. One nice thing about these AOIP consoles now, there is never a lack of mix minus. So we use bus minus, so you got gobs and gobs way to do clean feeds and intercoms between people. Marcus, I guess you would be the last one. Anything magical down there that you guys have been doing with Teams or anything like that?
No, just that last question from Jose is interesting. I can't say, and I've not really looked at it that closely, but I can't say I've noticed a huge quality shift in the likes of the Zoom audio. The audio from those applications always used to be fairly good, but I would just ask the question. I mean, at the end of the day, you're probably making no secret of the fact that these reporters are joining you through some type of app such as Zoom, and I don't really think in a lot of cases the listener or the watcher, in the case of those, is necessarily going to expect studio quality audio in themselves. It's part of the feature of bringing in those remote reporters, I'd say.
One thing I want to touch on about these new digital systems, Marcus, stuff that you have that's still on air in the 80s, stuff we even sold in the 90s and early 2000s. From all of you guys, and I'll start with Kelly Parker, because the first time I brought up remote working, it was early 2000s. I was talking to Kelly Parker, and he was on a public bus in San Francisco programming our bridge router. So for all of you guys, I mean, literally, he was on the bus with a Wi-Fi card talking to the bridge router over a network. How important is it these days that you guys can get into every phone systems, automation systems, console routing systems, video systems? How important is it for you guys?
It's essential. You'll die without it. With the lack of engineering staff on the premise, you have to have the ability to get in and power cycle things. So like cloud-based PDUs that you can use to cycle power on equipment if it's frozen, getting into remote access, any device, whether it's a codec, a PC, all of that is essential to operating anything technical these days. And that goes for not only studio sites, but the transmitter sites as well.
Yeah. And Marcus, go ahead, Kelly.
One more thing. Another key thing is monitoring software like a Nagios or a Cacti or any of these things that use SNMP to get information back, to notify you of what's going on. That's all essential pieces to managing this stuff remotely with no one there.
Brian, what about you? How much does it influence you as an engineer when you're consulting with these stations to buy stuff that you can get into remotely?
Absolutely. It's fantastic that you could get into virtually anything these days remotely. With anything that sits on your Wheatstone network, in particular, using the Navigator software, obviously, but all your codecs, all your blades, everything. I mean, you can get into everything. And it just makes our life so much easier. It also saves you, as Shaun has said, like it's going to save you a round trip. Well, You just do it on the computer and that's it.
Yeah.
You can interrogate, etc., etc. If you need to do any rerouting or any quick changes, it's just so much easier these days. That suits us, down to the ground.
Marcus, your territory spans islands, and the same for you. I mean, would you? I don't even recommend selling, and I don't like to sell people analog consoles anymore. And the reason why is because there is no interface to those, and I can't help you if you buy an old fashioned analog board.
I can't help you. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there are some mission critical, specific things. But Marcus, what about you? I mean, how many clients do you log in on a daily basis?
We won't sell a system. We won't do a system without that remote access, because I love Kelly's expression: "You'll die without it," and that's true. These systems are a whole lot more complex than their analog, but the features are so much more vast. But the ability for an end user or a customer to get themselves in trouble is also heightened. They can jump in there and they can do things that they may not be qualified to do because they want to play. And the ability to jump in there and restore a cross point, jump in there and see what's happened, jump in there and diagnose an issue because someone's powered off a codec or something and you see it's missing. No, absolutely vital.
Yeah. One of the most popular things we sell with a console, with an IP console system, is remote surface control. And I sell it like this. You're automated over the weekend. You still got your board up. Faders 1, 2, and 3 are up and on. They're at nominal level, and the cleaning lady comes in and turns pot 3 off. I mean, just to be able to open up, it happens. Just be able to open up a piece of software and turn that back on.
Jay, one other little thing as part of this remote diagnosis and this remote ability to help people, the logger in a system is such a vital piece of equipment. That thing sitting running in the background, and you get the customer going, something really funky happened at this time, and the automation system did this or whatever. Having the ability to actually jump in that log and see for yourself,
see what's going on.
Yeah. I'll tell a story for a second. I had an emergency phone call from a national broadcaster in Edmonton, and they called me and wanted to know why they went off the air for pretty much 9 minutes and 30 seconds one day. And it wasn't a technical man. He was like the general manager. He happened to call a support number and he got Jay. And I went to his log, and exactly at 12 p.m., every one of his blades went offline. And at like 9 minutes later, at 12:09, they all started coming back. And he was very upset. He wasn't technical. And, we pretty much said, okay, well, all of these black devices are connected with these little blue cables to a big silver thing. and at midnight, corporate from Toronto upgraded that big silver thing and rebooted it. And 9 minutes and 30 seconds later, all your blades came back online. There was an example where the log really helped me out as like a non-technical guy, but it was straightforward.
One thing in the community sector, especially here in Australia, is Marcus alluded to, is people like to play. And what I really like about IP and IP consoles is that you can lock certain functions down. So, that minimizes risk and failure as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, when I walk into a studio and I see that they've traced all the wood grain on the console wood and the wrist rest and the armrest, with all the screws with the pen, and there's paper clips hanging out of things, it's like, that's the guy you need to lock out of the board.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So one of the things we're talking about, radio stations, studios, and budgeting for them. Obviously we tell people you pick your manufacturer that you like. Your integrator may have recommended manufacturers that they want to work with because they know. I will tell everybody out there, after working with integrators all over the world, integrators recommend things for a reason. If they don't want you to do something, you probably heed their warning. If you bring a device to an integrator they've never seen before, there's going to be a learning curve. There's going to be a support curve. One of the things that this business still has today, even though it's changed a lot and it's evolving, we're really a relationship type business. Broadcast is. We tend to know everybody. Your integrators, Southern Broadcast, Brian, they all have relationships with certain manufacturers. And I think that brings a big efficiency to every single project, that they're working with stuff they know. They've got the wiring for it. They've got the programming for it. They've got the scripts for it. They know how the automation system works. I know that, they may, and I'm saying this in general, that the integrator, you may not like every single thing that they propose to you, but I encourage you to listen to them and benefit from their experience and their relationships over the years, because at the end of the day now, we're sort of building systems. We're not building a studio anymore. We're integrating the automation, the telephone system, intercom systems, routing, console mixing, and people. And so I always recommend, which is going to lead me into my next topic for our next 25 minutes, infrastructure. Kelly, where is the one spot that you don't want to save money on a project? And you're going to have to tell us a little bit about it and why.
I would say two spots. One is your cabling, and the other is the switch networking infrastructure that goes on with the cabling. Those two are critical to the success of your product or your project. If you buy cheap cabling out of the bargain bin at Home Depot, it's not likely going to do all that well. And I've got specific instances of it. To tell a quick story, we put one of our first IP systems on way back 20 years ago, probably. And the guy decided to try to use the old Cat3 cabling that he had going to his studio. And as much as we recommended that he not do that, he did it anyway, and then wondered why every time a PC rebooted or anything on the network changed, that audio would be interrupted. And I said, just do me a favor and drop a cable down the hallway and plug it in and see if it goes away. And he argued with me and finally did it and realized that it was the cabling that they tried to use to save a little bit of money. And that's not a place you want to save money.
And
and they're pulling on your cable, by the way.
Yeah, later we got a picture where they had 3 rolls of cable in the hallway and the ceiling tiles removed, and they were pulling all new cable.
Yes.
Yeah, because they were in an existing house and they were trying to save money and not do that. Cabling, how important is it to have it certified? I'm going to ask Shaun this because he's been doing a lot of builds lately where they didn't have total control. They were a contractor on these big projects, and things like wiring and some of the infrastructure was done by other companies. Shaun, can you comment about that and how important it is to maybe certify things and use reputable companies if you're not doing your own wiring?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing, like you mentioned, this is a relationship business in a lot of ways, and just being friendly with the folks the other contractors can go a long way. There have been a number of times I can think of on recent projects where we'd be on a daily stand-up call, say with the leadership or sort of executive team dealing with the build, and the project manager for the GC will say one thing about, oh yeah, all this cabling's done or whatever it might be, but because we've been talking to the electricians and the HVAC people and everybody else, we can be like, sorry, I just want to pipe up. We just talked to them and that's not going to be done for another 2 weeks. So stuff like that I think can go a long way. But also in certifying cabling, actually working with those low voltage installers to just ask them and make sure that they do it. Simply asking them to make sure they deliver the certification results after the fact seems to go a long way in actually making sure that certification is done thoroughly. In other cases, it's not part of their scope of work to do it, especially in smaller builds. So, we've invested in a full-on cable certifier, cable fiber certifier, and it's not cheap, but it is really valuable to us, not only to necessarily provide that cable certification service, but just as part of it helps us to know that the cabling all passes muster and we're not troubleshooting any weird issues down the road. So it's one of those things where you say, it's areas to not be areas you don't want to save money. I think, of course, the implication is, you don't end up saving money by sort of skimping in certain areas. And so, spending a couple days certifying all the wiring can very well save at least those couple days in troubleshooting down the road when something goes wrong.
Marcus, how many times have you gone to an install and you've seen bad cabling?
How many times have I been promised by the by the people on site, the client or the client's contractor or whatever, the cabling's good, and it just turns into a nightmare so many times. And like Shaun, to the point that we have also now bought cable certifying test equipment, and it's not that it's our job. We normally ask, and certainly when it's a new build, we ask for provision of the certification. But if you're going into a facility where the cabling is there and supposedly reliable, and they're asking you to use it, then that's the first thing that comes out is the piece of test kit, because we have seen and cabling, as Kelly started off talking about, cabling tends not to be a simple it's not good or it's good. Cabling is the thing that's just going to come up and frequently bite you in the butt. It's going to cause you strange network problems at, what's the time now for me? 3:45 in the morning. That's about the time that you hear about it, and it's always it's always someone else's problem. It's always the system's not working great. This isn't working great. And I think, Jay, it's one of your most common lines. Check your network, and that network does definitely include the cabling. Trust me.
There's a quick question there. Shaun, can you see the question on screen there? Do you think I'll read it to you. Would you answer this? It says, Bala had a good one. With rapidly evolving technology and increasing content demands, how can modern radio studios balance the need for state-of-the-art equipment while maintaining cost-effective budget without compromising quality and long-term scalability and operational efficiency? It sounds like AOIP to me.
Yeah, no, that's a really astute question by Bala, and I would essentially, say that, Jay, like the AOIP, this gear we're talking about is both top of the line and cost effective, right? Especially if you compare over time the cost of broadcast equipment, how that's changed over time, and how it's become a little bit more of a commodity, or at least some of the components inside of it have become a commodity that's brought the price down and made it more efficient for manufacturers to actually build this stuff and create software that runs inside it. But also, the alternative is so much worse in that it's really easy to make a case for the ROI. People talk about the old days where PRNE or whoever would bring in a whole team of integrators, and they'd bring in their semis and then have all the furniture and the gear and most importantly, a ton of people just like sitting there and like punching wires down to blocks and running multi-pair cabling and stuff. And while that's cool from like a nostalgic perspective, ultimately it costs quite a lot of money. So anything extra, you end up paying in, for the what we'll call audio over IP or top of the line equipment, very easily save that in labor costs and ongoing maintenance costs, because these systems are so extensible. So from a budgeting perspective, that's why so many stations, from small community stations to the large, corporate, enterprises, have the same equipment, because it's effective across the board for all of them.
No, it makes sense. And standardization, and then you get experts that we rely on within your own company to help you guys and support these systems. And another reason why standardization's helped is when somebody wants to make a change. If you've got 30 markets or you've got 25 stations across the country and you want to roll out new technology, you have a much better success rate having everybody on board with the same equipment. And that was one of the reasons the big groups here in America and Australia have standardized on stuff. It just brings the ROI up, and it's much more a way of governing and maintaining these systems by having everything the same. Right, Kelly? When you did Town Square, 380 stations, you picked an automation system, you picked a console vendor, headphone amps, everything.
Absolutely, and each site was built relatively the same with a few minor exceptions based on what they were doing, but it made it easy for us to support remotely.
Yeah, and Marcus, you've got a recipe for studios, right? You do have IDs and IP address and rack elevations, and you tend to want to do the same thing, not cookie cutter, but the same thing everywhere for maintenance reasons, right?
Well, especially amongst the particular sector of community stations that we have here with community access radio stations. They'll tend to be relatively similar. They'll all have 2 studios and they'll all have basic requirements in their racks. It's interesting, just to go back to Bala's question, and hi Bala, nice to see you here again this year. One of the things that I think you may be asking is also how we maintain the standard of equipment within the modern broadcast studio, because I know that the one thing that I hear quite often, and it tends to be as new management come in and new accountants come in and they start going, oh, that's expensive and that's expensive, and how come I'm spending all this money on an on-air console when I can go down to the local shop and buy a Rode Procaster and these sort of things, and it is really, remember what is important in the studio. I think is what's earning your money, what is needed to keep the revenue coming in, and that's why, as Shaun was talking about with ROI, it really is the good equipment, and this is across a number of manufacturers. Get the best equipment, because you're going to want over 10 years longevity out of this equipment, and if you can get management to understand that and build that in the budgets, just actually do a realistic comparison with how much that facility is going to spend on IT and IT replacement over the course of that 10 years. It's not hard to find where this becomes good value.
So we talked about cabling, we talked about leveraging tech here. Kelly, what's the second place that we never want to save money in these systems? And it doesn't matter if it's a major market or a community station in Yellowknife, Canada.
The switches. You want to buy good switches that can handle IGMP, which is critical to the operation of an IP system. So you want to make sure you buy good quality switches that can handle the traffic that you're going to put on them. There are those switches out there that people try. Another story, I had a guy down in South Africa that kept putting trend nets on his Wheatnet IP system, and he was complaining that he had to reboot it every couple of days. When you put an unmanaged switch in a system like that, you're going to have problems. So buy good switches. Make sure they're programmed right by Shaun and Inrush or anybody that has the ability to do that, because you're not going to necessarily have local staff to take care of that. So make sure that it's programmed properly. We have documents posted for stuff like that too to help out, but it's key.
Yeah, and guys, any of these AOIP systems, these are like sports cars, and the road or the racetrack they run on is your network. So cabling and switches, they are the most important thing about these AOIP networks, and manufacturers have recommendations for a reason. We've got hundreds and hundreds of man years experience. We get client feedback. We have folks from Arista and Cisco that call on us regularly. They want to make sure that they provide a good infrastructure for these devices. You are only going to ask these systems to do more and more and more over the years. Sort of going back to Bala's question, we're going to leverage technology. We're going to add to these networks. We may not be putting more microphones or more things that require cabling, but when we talk about automation systems, we talk about streaming. We bring streaming into all these radio stations now, video and audio. So the reason we use Cisco switches is because the querying and the IGMP settings that they do very, very well. We've had great luck with them. It's just something that people do. We recommend you have spares. I recommend you get your first time ever that you get your IT department involved in the broadcast side of things, and you let them know what these switches are for, They're for 24/7 operation. We recommend that you place them in the broadcast side of things. There's only been a handful of experiences since we've rolled out AOIP where I've asked a client to upgrade that Cisco switch. The first systems we shipped in 2008 are still running on the original Ciscos with the original firmware. Once you set these systems up, you pretty much never touch them again. The case where I needed to have a customer update their Cisco is they bought a 3850 switch and they were running on that. And a couple years later, they bought a new 3850 switch and running as a core, they needed to be on the same operating system. Kelly, do you have any thoughts on any of this when with the switches once they're set up?
You have to be critical to, I mean, there are bugs. So you need to check for bugs, and it's software. So the only time you stop finding bugs in software is when you stop looking. That's us, that's Cisco, that's any of the switch manufacturers. So you need to stay on top of those kinds of things, the maintenance, make sure you've got good firmware in the boxes. When you buy a switch 4 or 5 years and then you buy another one 4 or 5 years later, you got to make sure that they're the same. If you're going to try to stack them, most of the time a stack will update itself. So they're pretty intelligent in that way, but you need to follow up and make sure that it does that and that it works properly. But yeah, it's key to stay on top of it. Just like our stuff, you got to make sure you're on latest firmware and keeping everything under control.
Anything clients should look out there that have got these aging? I'll ask Shaun this. Have you seen anything, 10, 15 years after installing these systems, like on the switch side, do you see ports failing? Do you see switches dropping off the network?
Only seen a couple situations where we've had a port or part of the backplane of a switch actually fail. So yeah, that is extremely rare. Let me qualify that. It's rare in the sort of enterprise grade switches, right? In the lower cost prosumer, some of the newer lower cost switches can be great if you have a spare one on the shelf, and usually they're cheap enough that you can. But if you don't, you're dependent on something like a wall wart for power. In terms of other things over time, to go back to what Kelly said about adding monitoring to your infrastructure. We had a customer not too long ago that we just started working with them, and they had a network outage essentially on their audio over IP network. So our first thing we did was set up some monitoring on that switch to monitor some of the critical metrics like CPU and memory use. We added that to the monitoring system we were installing, and we found over time I don't remember which one it was, but it was the CPU or the memory was sort of creeping up over time, and it turns out there was a bug, in the software, a very slow one, but eventually would cause the unit to crash, and that was solved by upgrading firmware. So it's one of those things where, typically you don't have to mess with it too much, but if you set up monitoring, that way you actually know what's going on, and you can sort of predict failures before they happen.
Brian, because you're sort of our expert in the community station, so the stuff we've been talking about, is there any difference between what we're doing in major markets with switches and infrastructure than you're seeing in the community sector at all?
No. We use Cisco switches, full stop.
Okay.
They are basically nearly all audio over IP, say use Cisco. I think the main thing is to have make sure that you have someone. If you can't do it yourself, get yourself an IT professional to actually program them properly for the need. And as others have said, they'll last for years. They really will. I've never had one fail, but either core or edge switches, and we use both. But what I do at one of my major stations, we actually have two core switches and we actually split the network up. So they're both programmed the same. The ports are programmed the same. So we have, basically half the complex on one switch, the other half on the other switch. But because we've got all the other ports programmed, if something falls over, it's a very quick fix. I think that's a really good tip, because your core switch is really the heart of the system.
Yep.
Okay.
In addition to that, did you know, and a little tech device, that if you have a computer plugged into a Cisco switch with a Wheatstone driver, and that you have those same, let's say, Zeta channels up on the utility mixer, okay, and that utility mixer feeds your air chain. In the Wheatstone system, if that core switch dumped, as you said,
Yeah.
you could unplug that cable from the Zeta machine that goes to the switch and plug it directly into that transmission blade where you've got your little A-serve mix and output going on. And within a few seconds, that multicast will rejoin that utility mixer, and you can get around the entire system with directly. So basically, the blade's acting as a sound card at that point.
Yeah, I mean that's a quick fix to keep you on the air. But when you've got a multi-studio complex, I mean you are really relying on that switch.
Yeah, and which leads me to something that we didn't discuss earlier: updates. Anybody that has, well, let me say this: nobody should really ever be off the air with an AOIP system. In this day and age, you should have backups, whether it's backup players, backup sources on your STLs into your processors. But at one point, if you have an AOIP system, you are going to need to get around it for a couple minutes at some point in its life. So when you're planning this from the ground up and you're working with your clients, you've got to have a way to get around these systems, because you're going to get a software update from us someday. You're going to get a software update from Cisco someday, and you need to actually get around these systems. So Kelly, how do you do it at Town Square?
A number of ways. Zeta is one of the great things about Zeta is the ability to play out of an audio driver and a sound card at the same time. So if you want to have the expense of that and have a sound card in it as well, you could have an analog or AES output play to air and bypass the system. But most of the time we would forego that and use clip players or other audio devices at transmitter sites that we could put on and bypass the studio facility altogether. And then any kind of maintenance you want to do, software updates, it's all easy at that point because you're running from a remote location.
Shaun, what do you do? What is your plan B recommendation for clients?
Yeah, so like Kelly, a couple different ways. One would be to have an analog or AES3 or other backup. The other way, at bare minimum, is to tie into what Brian was talking about, where you kind of segment your network in a sort of intelligent way, where say you have your main air chain and your backup air chain sort of set up on different blades in different racks, but for the same station, potentially based on the kind of upgrade you're doing, you may be able to just switch to your backup air chain, upgrade the blades that you switched away from, and then switch back and continue. So you can kind of shuffle things around in a way that doesn't necessarily require analog backups, and also, like Kelly said, having sort of a break glass automation system synced up at the transmitter site, especially with a lot of content being pre-recorded at this point, and a lot of the what would have been live content, voice tracked, even if it's a few minutes in advance. As long as those systems are talking, it's almost just seamless to move your play out to the transmitter site for an hour or something. But I think it is important to have those systems in place. So a lot of times, for us, being able to do those sort of things that are otherwise a bit disruptive, doing them like during the day when everybody's awake, when you can have the right people engaged from both the client and sometimes the manufacturer, being able to do those things during production and not trying to necessarily sneak them in overnight is huge. Not only do you have those right people around if there's any issues, But also, you're not tired. We're not tired. It's not 2 a.m. and we're, maybe not thinking straight. Having those systems in place from the very beginning as part of the system design is huge. And to talk about budgeting, saves the time of whoever you're having come in to do these upgrades in general, but also, saves potential overtime, time and a half, special rates, or even emergency rates when you can easily, switch to these backup systems in any scenario. That can actually be a really smart budget move for stations.
Yeah,
those systems should be tested regularly too, by the way.
Yeah, I had an old-time engineer tell me years ago that bad planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part. So yeah, proper planning and having these things in place. So I want to say we've got a lot more viewers out here, and for people that maybe joined late, you can also play this back at a later day on Red Tech. So one last topic that I want to talk to everybody about, streaming. Streaming seems to be just as important these days for a lot of these groups as their main transmitter signal. And what are some, what are the advantages now? And some people, major groups have mandated that they keep their streams on and they treat all their streaming like they do their transmission. Kelly, I know that you were part of Town Square's rollout, so you did over 80 markets with streaming. Tell us a little bit about rolling those out and how metadata, because you did a lot of that in and out of Zeta for all of your stations. And why did you guys choose to standardize on streaming?
We standardized because we had PCs in all the markets running different versions of software and processing, and Windows machines fail. They do updates. Some people ignore the updates, and then when you finally do it, it takes 24 hours for it to finally update. So moving to a Linux device like Wheatstone or Wheatnet or Streamblade were ideal for us to get that off of a Windows PC, get it in a controlled environment, and get some consistency with the processing that was on the stations. When you have a format that's played across the country, the streams are all consistent. That was one of the biggest things they pointed out. The CEO of Town Square came to me and said, "Our streams all sound different. Why?" And that was a key part in getting that cleaned up, getting the audio levels consistent. And we rolled out, I think, 75 or 76 Streamblades across the company to handle the 300 plus radio stations. And the Lua filtering and stuff that handles the metadata processing and parsing, that's all key to whatever streaming provider you're using for covering ad insertion on the other side. It needs to be a controlled parsing of the information and passed along to the provider so they know what to cover when you get into spots. We had an instance where guys were putting commercials in, or putting their music, new songs, in a spot category, and the songs were getting covered. Well, that's why, because they put them in the wrong category. So little simple thing, all of that triggers what's happening on the streaming provider end when you're covering the spots and playing music.
Awesome. Marcus, you rolled out some streaming over in New Zealand at REMA and a few other markets. Is there anything that you're doing with metadata or anything over there that's unique to your operations?
Well, not more than anywhere else in the world. I mean, the metadata that is used, as Kelly was saying, is essential for the streaming provider, and based on the platform and the sophistication of what they're delivering up to the end user is absolutely quintessential in the experience that user gets, whether it be the ad insertion that Kelly was talking about, or just simply the amount of rich experience in terms of visuals that come with it, or really the entire streaming experience is tied down to that metadata.
Shaun, do you guys do anything with metadata in Inrush or anything with phone systems, or how do you use metadata in your applications?
Yeah, I mean, for streaming, like everybody said, it's really essential. No matter what sort of CDN you're using, or what sort of middleware you're using to sort of interpret that metadata, you still need to get it to that system. And a lot of times it does make sense to do that through the streaming appliance or the software. So, and also having those two options, again, from a budgetary perspective, depending on your capabilities as a station, having the ability to purchase a appliance like Streamblade you can kind of throw in the rack and just have it work with a known interface and not a ton of variables is huge. But then also being able to have Wheatstream and having software-based processing or software-based stream encoding for those that maybe do have virtual machine environments or are looking for an excuse to start one, that can be a great step into it where you can potentially save some cost, especially on the hardware side over time by being able to kind of fraction that hardware into multiple purposes. So having those options and starting with streaming, I think is a great place to start for virtualization.
And Brian, with your geographic restraints down there, how important is streaming to your mid and small market stations?
Streaming, yeah, down here, they don't use, and this applies to a lot of the stations. They don't heavily use any sort of metadata. They'll use basic streaming with external type processing, et cetera, et cetera. Community radio, they all want streaming, but they want it very basic, and that's just the way it is down here. Okay. So.
All right. Well, basically, so what we've been talking about today, obviously, is building new studios. The must-haves in new studios, and we've pretty much summed up. We need remote connectivity for all the devices and everything on the network. The ability to control things, consoles and stuff. The infrastructure requirements. What else do we miss? Is there anything else that we want to talk to the users out there about?
I have a couple of thoughts. One is we go back to, I don't know if it was Marcus or Shaun that mentioned it, but it was the tactile feel of a real console versus the glass console. That was a very big concern at Town Square when we first started rolling out, because we did hundreds of glass consoles. And I kind of dealt with that, saying that you deal with it every day right here. So people are used to it. And I found that the younger generations were actually harder to get through that process than the older guys, which I thought would be the opposite. But it wasn't in most cases. The other guys are just kind of like, yeah, whatever, I'll go along for the ride. But that tactile feel is key. So when he brought it up, that kind of stuck in my mind. The other thing that I would point out is being a guy that's been through a couple of breaches, the remote access that we're speaking of, you really need to take precautions on making sure that your network is secure when you put these remote access programs or whatever you're using, whether it's TeamViewer or BombGuard or Datto, whatever it is, you need to make sure your networks are secure and that you're doing everything you can to keep people out. You don't want to go through a breach. I've been through two, and it's horrible. So protect yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got just a couple of tips, Jay, if we can share those. In the community radio space, we tend to find that stations and people within stations need more than just computers, right? All our commercial world people, they basically live by computers because they have a program director, they have set playlists, etc., etc. In the community radio world in Australia, there can be stations that every program can be different. They'll have their own music. They'll bring their own music, but they'll bring it on all different platforms. Now, a favourite request that we're getting is to have some type of analog input, whereby they can put in the tablet, laptop. What we do and try and encourage them to put some type of automation software on their own laptops to play the music. A lot of presenters do that these days, but that's a big requirement. As we said earlier, a USB port. A lot of people want to be able to actually record their program in studio and then at the end of the program, send that straight back to the USB stick for a record. And they can take that away and they can listen to their program. They're two big things. And another request, believe it or not, people want phone charging access on the studio desk, right? So we put in power outlet with a inbuilt phone charger with a USB A and C, and you'd be surprised the number of people will wander in. Oh, my phone's not working. Oh, okay, we've got a charger. Terrific. Or and also it helps with putting in devices like your laptop or your tablet power supplies, whatever, so they haven't got cables draped all over the studio, etc., etc. That's a big thing these days. They are requirements that people are asking for. Over and above turntables, would you believe? One of my stations, they had to have their turntables put back in when we did the rebuild. They would not allow us to remove the turntables.
Those are fun times to revisit, aren't they? Scratching around for phono preamps and going, I cannot believe I'm back here again.
Well, exactly. But they wanted them. I've even got a station that demanded, and you've been there, Jay. They demanded that mini disc and a cassette player be put back in one studio.
Have they used it yet?
You would not believe when you're working with a multicultural station that's got over 400 presenters and they broadcast in 48 different languages. You'd be surprised what they bring in. It's incredible, and it can be, and quality wise, I mean, we have no control over that, but it could be anything. Seriously.
But in your situation, Brian, that makes sense. You need one. Not everybody we're not building arcs. We're building radio studios. And with today's tech, you can put that turntable or that mini disc on. It wires into a blade somewhere. You don't have to have one in every studio. If somebody wants to go use that in another studio, they can. That's one of the nice things, that you don't need a dedicated piece of gear. And in the USB, that's like the poor man's driver. I love it. I love selling software, but I got to tell you, everybody out there, if you've got a PC that doesn't need control, and when I say control, you don't want to remote start it from the console. It doesn't need to do any routing. It's not going to light any lights. Things like Adobe Audition, the internet computer. That's a really good, or the remote laptop that you want to bring in with all the network and all the security issues we have out there. Somebody's not going to let you bring in a foreign laptop and plug it into somebody's enterprise system. So being able to get audio in and out of like an M4 or something USB port is really, really good. And then again, you can get a USB cable for anybody's phone, iPad, tablet, or whatever. But it's a great little addition to every single studio for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
What else? Any other tips, guys, before we wrap up today? Anything else? Because stuff that we're talking about applies to any type of radio station, studio. Doesn't matter what format you are. Talk, sports, music. All of these, everything that we talked about applies. Is there anything else that each of you guys want to leave our listeners with a message, Marcus?
The only other thing I will say is when we rewired the studios at this big ethnic station, we actually didn't run one cable. If it required two cables, we ran three. So we always run a backup. That's just a tip. And it may save you a lot of money further down the track as technology changes, or you want to put another device or something in that's got to go back into your network or back to your rack room.
I'll finish with that. A continuity test is not a cable certification.
True.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. That's still our number one support issues. When we're not having a professional install and we're letting people that, I'd say about 25-30% of the people install their own gear that we sell to factory direct. And, it's one of the biggest support issues that we have. And, a bad cable, it's not whether it works or not. It may work under certain conditions at midnight when there's no traffic on the network and nobody's doing anything. But during the day, when people come in and start firing computers up, if you've got a marginal cable, it will be the death of your AOIP system for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you've got to use quality cable, and you've got to get it certified. Or in our case in Australia, you have a cabling certification, which I have. So it means I'm certifying it. So if it doesn't work, it's on me. So simple as that.
Yep. Marcus, anything you want to say to our audience about what you've learned over the years and do's and don'ts?
Oh, yeah, so many, but we don't have that time. No, I think we've covered it off between this session and the one we did last year. There's always good ideas flying around the place. Always good to get interaction with people that are watching and asking questions. Some good hints today. I think probably the most pertinent what has been around that networking and the certification of cables, because we just had it within the last couple of months, that exact situation, where we had some just bizarre things turning up in the log, bizarre behaviors, things that had everyone scratching their head. And as soon as we stick a proper network tester on it, and as Kelly said, continuity does not a network cable make. You need to put the proper test equipment on it that can actually test that cable to its proper specifications, and believe me, it'll show up things that you didn't realize were there, and it's essential.
Shaun?
Well, I think from a budgeting perspective, one thing that can be really helpful is even if you have folks in-house who can install the equipment, it can be really helpful to go to a firm like ours or anyone else's on the panel and ask for basically some consulting services on putting that equipment list together. Being able to actually, get some advice on where money is well spent and where it might not well be spent. Actually talking about, how the equipment, the life cycle of the equipment is, and being able to sort of calculate a bit of a ROI on it. A firm like ours can kind of come in, look at your engineering costs and labor and time, and do some interviews on how much time the local staff spends on fixing current gear or pouring contact cleaner into switches or whatever, and come up with a rough number of what will this actually save you over time, and can present some other ideas too, like as Jay said, these stations are becoming you can do a lot more with a lot less gear, but also with a lot less space. And so gearing your studios towards that and making sure that folks can be brought in remotely, whether it's talent or guests, again, that can save you some real estate and can be, the difference between occupying an entire floor to half a floor or something like that. And that can help pay for your studio upgrades pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would. I'll commenting on that. There's a lot of expertise in the world with these integrators out there, and the guys from Inrush, King Audio, Southern Broadcast. It's definitely worth your time as a station owner or a station engineer to have a conversation with somebody outside your circle that's been doing this. I think you're going to find a lot of efficiencies, and I think that you'll end up having a better product on air by working with an integrator or somebody outside your circle on the synergies between all the equipment, everything that we've going on. Broadcast is still a really small, slow evolving industry, but there's lots of solutions that off the shelf and on the shelf solution that these guys can bring to you. I'm going to ask anybody in the listening audience if they've got any other further questions that they might want to reach out. If not, I'm sure you can directly reach out to Brian or Shaun or Marcus, Kelly, myself. Since there's no more questions, I'd like to thank all our panelists again for covering all the topics that we spoke about today, and everybody paying attention to Radio Week here from the Red Tech folks. And thank you for Red Tech. It's been a great opportunity to present our solutions for you guys, and I look forward to seeing everybody out in the field and possibly again next year at this.
All right, thank you for having us, Jay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
We'll see y'all
Jay.
soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.